Okay, everyone, stop what you're doing. This is not a drill. We have not one, but two academic opinion papers that, unbeknownst to me, came out this year. On the same day even, that finally confirms what I've been saying on this channel and other platforms for years now. Ever since I started writing articles and posting videos on the subject of exotic pet ownership, I've been subjected to spiteful, condescending, and sometimes downright demeaning comments from people who are very confident in their understanding of the word domestication and which animals qualify as such. In fact, the word domestication is extensively used not only by the lay public, but also by high-ranking scholars in various research and medical fields to distinguish two seemingly distinct groups of animals. One, suitable and completely accepted to be maintained in human households. The other, utterly wrong for captivity, only suitable to be maintained in professional, accredited zoological facilities, and only under such circumstances that the captivity can be justified under educational and conservation purposes. To violate this moral rule, to keep a non-domesticated animal as a pet, is a perversion of nature and practically criminal in the eyes of many. I get told by online strangers that I'm evil, and they hope my pets maul me, and I get cold reactions from even close family members due to the socially unacceptable animals that I care for, which they probably think I'm oblivious to. Well, this comfortable black and white view of domestication that we've all clung to our whole lives, it's finally time to admit that it is absolutely false. The whole domesticated versus non-domesticated thing is a false dichotomy. It simply doesn't exist. Now, the papers don't actually say this exactly, but I'll get into why this is the case in a few. What these two papers discuss are the difficulties, or rather, the impossibilities, of coming up with a simple definition for domestication that actually works. Both papers seem to agree that both the lay public and scientists have preconceived ideas of which animals and plants are domesticated, and what's worse, they base their research and findings on these inconsistent concepts. Let's first illustrate what people tend to think domestication is. I think Wikipedia has a pretty good example. Domestication is a multi-generational mutualistic relationship in which an animal species, such as humans or leafcutter ants, takes over control and care of another species, such as sheep or fungi, to obtain from them a steady supply of resources, such as meat, milk, or labor. The process is gradual and geographically diffuse, based on trial and error. Domestication affected genes for behavior in animals, making them less aggressive. In plants, domestication affected genes for morphology, such as increasing seed size and stopping the shattering of cereal seed heads. Such changes both make domesticated organisms easier to handle and reduce their ability to survive in the wild. I'd say most people would nod their heads and agree with this. Sounds pretty scientific, right?
Oh, ain't that cute? But it's wrong!
But despite how well thought out it appears, it doesn't work at all. In a universally applicable definition for domestication, Catherine Lord, whose work I've discussed before, and her co-authors detail why our current understanding of domestication is invalid, and it's a lot to unpack. I'd say that what first led me down the domestication doesn't exist rabbit hole is the undeniable fact that many so-called domesticated species are not being controlled by humans and are free-ranging. Yes, even dogs, which I think can be considered to be the crown jewel of a culturally considered traditional domesticate. Lord et al. Brought this up in a previous paper that challenged the existence of the domestication syndrome, or a suite of phenotypic traits that domesticated populations appear to share, which was supposedly proven by the famous Russian farm fox experiment. That great 2020 paper went into depth reviewing the evidence for common claims about domestication that simply don't add up, including short muzzle length as an indicator of domestication, which doesn't vary between domestic and wild cats, and how the existence of intensively inbred dog breeds is often incorrectly used to validate the idea of domestication traits. The new 2025 paper builds on this research and challenges the idea that domestic species are defined by their being under human control. Domestic species have emerged from a greater diversity of interactions than this perspective allows, and none of the many definitions proposed for domestication can readily, reliably, and consistently distinguish domestic and non-domestic populations. I've never understood how people fail to acknowledge the existence of so-called feral forms of domesticates when declaring that domesticated animals cannot survive in the wild. Therefore, granting us special permission to own them as pets in their minds. Expanding on the control aspect, Lord et al. Dismantle the idea that humans created all domesticated animals by plucking unsuitable wild animals from their habitat and bringing them into human-controlled confinement to selectively breed them into docile domestics. For some reason, I think a lot of laypeople believe this folklore. The way we utilize certain domesticated species today does not mean that was how they originally underwent any potential genetic changes. Lord et al. States as an example that chickens were not initially used as food by humans, but that they were simply living commensally with humans like mice and rats, having been attracted to human crops. Like the 2020 paper, Lord makes a grand point. How do we even know what changes took place in so-called domesticated animals if we cannot compare them to their original ancestors? Contrary to popular belief, there is no definitive evidence of the non-domesticated populations that domesticated populations supposedly descended from, aside from limited exceptions. Even the quintessential domesticate, the dog, has a confusing history that continues to be debated. In the minds of most laypeople, dogs simply came from wolves. I often reiterate on this channel, dogs did not come from the wolves you're thinking of. Those large canids that we picture running through snow or traveling in packs, they only share a common ancestor with dogs. And even if they were the direct descendants of the dog's original ancestor, we would not be able to compare any potential changes between them and dogs. This is because evolution never stops. This population would have undergone evolutionary changes just as dogs have. Throw into the mix that different animal populations may interbreed, and you have an impossible-to-decipher hellscape of genetic interactions that simply defy the often-thought point A to point B concept of domestication that people tend to hold. Speaking of interbreeding, hybridization is another way animals can evolve, and has been involved in so-called domestication histories. This can explain some of the so-called dramatic shifts in phenotypes that we believe, ever so incorrectly, take, quote, thousands of years to occur. A statement I hear everywhere, and often retorted towards me by people who believe I have an inept understanding of domestication. When thinking about domestication and what I personally consider it to be, I quickly drafted this chart, just to provide an idea of how insanely simplified the version of domestication is that has been fed to the public by scientists. The paper also discusses what are termed neologisms, or new words that attempt to describe the intricacies of different domestication forms. For example, the word semi-domesticated, a word I used to use but eventually grew to hate, because semi-domesticated makes as much sense as semi-evolved, and considering that domestication is an ill-defined concept, one simply cannot detail a midpoint in a process where no one can determine where the finish line is. Since we have no way to determine domestication through morphologies, ancestors, behavior, or genetics, what? It's often a word used to describe animals that seem to fit assumed domestication traits, such as those that are in human control, but no one wants to call them domesticated because, well, we wouldn't want to equate an elephant and a dog, right? Due to our cultural perceptions, biases, and version of ethics, I honestly think that's all it is. People being so hell-bent on separating the species they don't like to be considered as part of human society, to the point that they create fake definitions that unknowingly undermine decades of research, including, of course, literature that provides a scientific basis for attacking alternative pet ownership. I've been calling out these inconsistencies for a while now, and have developed somewhat of a distrust for zoological-related academia as a result. Animals cannot be semi-domesticated, and bonobos, which don't even live around humans, are not self-domesticated because they are less aggressive than chimps, an entirely separate species and population. None of that ever made sense. The latter sprang forth due to the erroneous idea that wild animals are not normally some level of docile. Yet another reason exotic pet ownership is resented and seen as reckless and selfish. Even humans themselves have been described as domesticated in some papers. This idea that we occupy some unique and advanced level of docility and civility feeds into the ideas that are expounded upon in the second paper I'll discuss. Going back to the Wikipedia definition, it makes no sense to include leafcutter ants as domesticators like humans. The word specifically describes the impacts of the human species, since they are significantly more altering than other species. So, how does Lord's paper define domestication? We propose that domestication be defined simply as evolution in response to an anthropogenic niche. That's almost verbatim how I've said it should be defined in many conversations, especially the anthropogenic niche part. This definition applies to select populations that are undergoing these changes, so there can be members of the same species that have different statuses instead of labeling a species as domesticated or non-domesticated. However, there's a significant caveat. The researchers add that only obligate synanthropes should carry the designation of domestic. The paper describes these as a population of animals that can only sustain itself in the anthropogenic environment and not outside of it. I'm a little confused if the word domestic is considered to be the same as domesticated, as I tend to use the word domestic to describe something living in a home, while domesticated refers to a genetic change. As for the term synanthrope, which describes animals that have evolved to live near humans, when I first found out about this word, it didn't make sense to me that many sources explicitly stated that synanthropic is not the same as domesticated. This must have been due to, again, cultural aversion to including animals like rats, roaches, and mice under the domestication term, which are seen as pests instead of societal members like dogs. I had determined that there's no reason to separate synanthropic species, which, according to the definition, also includes most of the world's dogs, as well as macaque monkeys, urban red foxes, and raccoons. Of course, most people would want to reject these species. According to the paper, these special animal obligate domestics that require human disturbance to subsist include fruit flies, rats, cats, dogs, and house sparrows. And they actually exclude horses, which can sustain their populations without humans. This is probably the first time I've seen a real attempt to create a definition for domestication that is actually consistent, scientific, and quantifiable. And what happens? The horse, a species beloved by humans with a consensus for its domestication status and universal acceptance around the world as a captive pet, gets kicked out. This definition also seems to eliminate human captivity and control from the equation entirely, instead focusing on how animals evolve when left to their own devices. This meaning of domestication, if it were to be accepted by scientists, would obliterate the concept of using the word to describe animals supposedly more suitable for captivity or human use. Human control, according to our next paper, has been very popular with the lay public's view of domestication, but since 2009, the scientific community has been abandoning the concept favoring unconscious selection, or rather, simply unremarkable evolution. The paper by Spengler et al., Seeking Consensus on the Domestication Concept, emphasizes that the domestication process is not some novel innovation by humans, as is popularly thought. Rather, animals are adapting to environmental change, as they always have done. And this is something I've definitely concurred with. The so-called domestication traits that animals have evolved are not special. Rather, these traits exist in so-called wild animals, along with numerous other traits. Thus, that also obliterates the supposed special status of so-called domesticated animals as being uniquely suited for captivity, and the idea that wild animals do not have the same traits. The paper explores the term in a more cultural and psychological context. I've noticed that domestication has always been interpreted differently due to the researcher's field of specialty. For instance, geneticists would favor looking at information from advanced technology that reveals genetic relationships, while archaeologists would look at the fossil record. Historians and anthrozoologists are more concerned with descriptions of domesticated animals available from literature and art, while ecologists would focus on the organism's interactions with the environment. Discussed in the paper are how various ideas of domestication concepts by scholars have been influenced by ideological, moralistic, and colonialist perspectives, including the view of domestication being deemed a conscious innovation of civilized or intelligent societies, and in contrast, others opined that not domesticating animals was a moral decision by ancient peoples. While Charles Darwin seemed to favor more unconscious views of domestication, other early scholars often incorporated a view of these animals as a product of human labor, and that such animals were unnatural and removed from nature to serve man. Archaeologists from the 1980s and 1990s have also embraced the narrative that domestication represented humans' mastery over nature, and it's one of their greatest innovations. This is a mentality I see present even today, as the hardwired belief people have of a clear separation of the domesticated from the so-called wild species often results in emotion-laden, angry remarks in my comments. Perhaps there is a deeper psychological reason this occurs. The paper urges against any domestication definition that adheres to any ideological thinking. They also challenge the idea of the ideal domesticate, comparing it to claiming that an Australopithecine is an under-evolved human. Such statements would hinge upon an unscientific bias of what is considered ideal based on one's own experiences. Evolution is a process that never stops or has an endpoint. There is no such thing as a complete or finished domesticated animal. These erroneous ideas are often perpetuated by the general lay public. Given that evolution describes a shift in allele frequencies in a population, Spengler et al. Favor the following as a definition for a domesticated species. A domesticated clade is any lineage of organism that is phenotypically distinct from other lineages because of evolutionary differences resulting from interactions with humans. And the term domestication would be a change in heritable phenotypic traits in a population over time, resulting from interactions with humans. Within these criteria, the authors state that all organisms that evolve in response to human activity, including all organisms evolving in response to mutualistic, commensal, or parasitic relationships with humans, as well as predation, hunting, and anthropogenic habitat modification, including the introduction of toxins, such as herbicides, all fall along the domestication spectrum. Furthermore, commensal domesticates are described as any organisms that evolve to have reduced stress responses in the presence of humans without benefiting or harming people. Finally, examples of these organisms include dogs and cats, of course, but also wild mice, rats, and wild birds that live in cities and visit bird feeders because they have changed morphologies in response to these human environments. The definition also includes urban foxes, which I've made a video about. Any driver of heritable change can qualify, whether they are epigenetic changes, movement of a transposable element, reduction in neural crest cell production, or transcriptional control. The aforementioned hybridization also counts, which can cause rapid changes in a species. This extremely broad definition, the paper suggests, would come to encompass a large number of species and draw attention to the impact that humans are having on nature. Of course, the definition veers tremendously from the popular idea of what domesticated animals and plants are, but the authors state that this is a consequence of giving the word a valid meaning over our personal whims. We recognize the concern here, as some scholars may feel an emotional difference between a peppered moth and a dog, but our goal is to construct a definition based on logic as opposed to emotion. These criteria are similar to Lord et al., although missing is the requirement that the population needs to lack self-sustainment without humans. The broader version of domestication is what I've been using, although I've included captive populations, like zoo animals, that Lord et al. Specifically excludes. This is because their definition hinges on the organism adapting to a human niche, and captivity is, by definition, not even an ecological niche, because they are artificial and human-controlled, intentionally lacking a complex distribution of resources, predators, competitors, and other factors. Thus, this eliminates the concept of domestication that many hold, that domesticated animals cannot survive outside of human care, thus making it ethical to own them, over animals that can survive without us. However, it was never true that all so-called domesticated animals cannot survive outside of direct human care. Rather, select debilitated breeds and intensively bred populations often are not viable survivors because they have compromised health or self-sufficiency. An ethical quandary on its own, that is ironically presented to exotic pet owners as a superiorly moral pet-keeping practice. In contrast, as brought up by Lord et al., captive-born carnivores, which are considered wild by the lay public, are more likely to die when reintroduced to the wild than those that are wild-born, proving that there is an inherent difference between these populations, in addition to the morphology changes that I've brought up in other videos. Unintentional selection is inevitable in all captive populations, even those under specialized breeding programs designed to retain genetic diversity, because individuals that do not tolerate captivity well often have reduced or eliminated breeding success. This favors individuals that can adapt to human presence, especially those living on display for zoo visitors. If zoo animals and other captive-bred animals, despite having undergone such changes, are not domesticated, what category do they fall under? Regardless, it seems that both definitions ironically favor what I refer to as wild animals, or animals subsisting outside of human care, as the only populations that could be considered domesticated. A stunning reversal on the selective breeding narrative. I do wonder about Lord et al.'s proposed definition, however, because a population failing to become self-sustaining in a certain human niche does not mean that humans were the cause. For instance, an escaped population of lizards would fail to form self-sustaining populations in Maine, simply due to cold temperatures. Another species might require a specific food source that is not available. In contrast, a population that can seemingly only subsist in a given human niche could be due to factors of the wild environment away from humans that just happen not to be suitable for that species. For instance, if an escaped population were able to survive only around humans because they could take shelter in human-created structures from cold temperatures, such a species would not be considered domestic if it escaped into a warmer climate and could survive outside of cities. Therefore, I'm not sure how much information domestic status would give us under Lord et al.'s definition in species that are not widespread enough to have escape potential throughout the country to be exposed to multiple conditions to test their viability. One of the domestic obligate synanthropes cited by the paper, urban house sparrows, have had their populations aided by intentional releases by people, especially in the United States. Such advantages were not afforded to most other animals, thankfully. Therefore, I'm thinking that a combination of environmental appropriateness, human tolerance, and the number of founders present would ultimately control the outcome of whether or not a captive or introduced species could have self-sustaining populations within or outside of an anthropogenic niche. With both definitions, I can't help but notice that they have been constructed in a way that seeks to define domestication in the same sense that has been done in the past, by assuming these separate categories of animals must exist. I think both papers have shown that the domestication concept was inherently flawed, and that is the entire reason scholars have struggled to define it and consistently place species into such specialized categories. Both papers make mention that the concept is important because it can have implications in how we view species and carry out conservation efforts. They also put the spotlight on human presence and how it is altering nature. I feel the papers have deconstructed the word domestication into a shadow of its former self to the point that I wonder if it really needs to exist. The word has certainly been inappropriately applied to captive animals to declare their supposed suitability in human-controlled conditions, mentally and physically. It has led people to view certain species as designed to be confined or instinct-free. So no, I'm not saying that any of these definitions presented are perfect or will become the new scientific consensus. That remains to be seen. Although they do finally demonstrate a real effort to use the word without nonsensical bias. What both papers prove is that domestication has never been defined and has been used arbitrarily, often to discuss animals that are the most popularly kept in our society. In other words, it's currently meaningless. Yet it has proven to have consequences for me and others with pets that have a permanently wild status. Domestication has been masquerading as a scientific word for far too long, when it was really a soft term to describe species of high familiarity to the speaker, and those with a longer history with humans. When I'm told my animals are not domesticated, that just means my pets will never be accepted, mainstream pets. Words have meanings. If we don't adequately define a word, we cannot have a real conversation. The word domestication is exceptionally important. It has been used to otherize my pets and even serves as a basis to make it illegal for me to travel through certain states with them, enter shelters with them in the event of natural disasters, or even own them at all. So, it's time we start acknowledging that it's all been a giant misnomer.